In part 3 of our build guide, we remove the front suspension and drop the subframe. Draining the front brake lines will prevent a big mess later. Start by removing the lid from the reservoir. Uncover the brake bleeder and place a 10mm wrench on it. Attach the vacuum hose and open the bleeder. This vacuum pump will be used again in the future when it comes time to bleed your brakes. Pump the handle to create a vacuum in the line. You will see the fluid flowing out into the pump's reservoir. When the brake fluid stops coming out, tighten the bleeder and remove the hose. Don't forget to reinstall the bleeder cap. Use a 13mm wrench to disconnect the steel brake line. Then use pliers to pry off the steel retaining clip. You'll use the clip later, so don't throw it away. Steer toward the side you are working on to make it easier to get to the caliper bolts. Use a 15mm socket to take out the caliper bolts and remove the caliper. Pry out the rotor retaining clips with a paint scraper and screwdriver. Then use wire cutters to break the clips off. Remove the rotor. Use an 18mm socket to disconnect the sway bar link. Install strut spring compressors on the front and rear of the spring. Don't worry about tightening the compressors. Finger tight is good enough. Put a jack under the ball joint and raise it up until the spring compresses slightly. Use a 21mm socket to remove the top strut nut. Then use an 18mm socket to take the nuts off the lower strut bolts. Tap the strut bolts out. Don't hammer directly on the end of the strut bolts. Pry the bottom of the strut away from the knuckle and remove the strut. Use a 30mm socket to remove the axle nut. This nut is very tight. Tap the axle free from the bearing hub. Don't hammer directly on the end of the axle. Use a 15mm and a 16mm socket to remove the ball joint clamp bolt. Lift the knuckle off of the ball joint. Use a 15mm socket to remove the bearing hub bolt. Discard the sheet metal shield, but keep the knuckle, bearing hub, and bolts. Reinstall the axle nut and washer. Use a 10mm socket to remove the transmission fluid check plug near the bottom of the automatic transmission. With a manual transmission, look for a drain plug on the side of the pan. Drain at least 1 quart of transmission fluid so that when you pull the axles later, you won't make a mess on your floor. Reinstall the plug and wipe excess transmission fluid. You can clean up more thoroughly after the powertrain is removed from the car. Disconnect one end of the overflow line from the cylinder head. Disconnect the other end from the overflow tank. Do not throw away the overflow line. Use a 13mm socket to remove the passenger side radiator mount to make it easier to get to the radiator drain plug. Open the plug and drain the coolant system. It is illegal and dangerous to vent the AC system yourself. You should have a professional recover the refrigerant before disconnecting the AC lines. After the AC system is emptied, use a 13mm socket to disconnect the lines from the condenser. Use the same socket to disconnect the AC line up near the intake manifold. Then use a screwdriver to pry the lines apart. Soak the steering knuckle and shaft with penetrating oil. Then use a 13mm socket to remove the steering knuckle bolt. Use a hammer and a paint scraper to break the plastic clip on the driver's side radiator mount. Then use a 13mm socket to remove the mount. Use the hammer and paint scraper again to break the plastic clips holding the side panels. The passenger side panel is also held by a bolt. Use a 10mm socket to remove it. Put a jack and a 2x4 under the subframe. Line the board up with the front pivots of the control arms. Use a 15mm socket to remove the rear transmission mount bolts. Use a 21mm socket to remove both of the rear subframe bolts. Use a 15mm socket to remove the control arm bolts and then pull the control arm out. Use an 18mm socket to remove the front transmission bolt. Use a 21mm socket to remove both of the front subframe bolts. Lower the jack just until the subframe hangs on the steering shaft. Hammer a screwdriver up into the steering knuckle split. As you hammer, the subframe should drop. Lower the subframe down and pull it out from under the car. Use an 18mm socket to remove the steering rack. Use a 15mm socket to remove the sway bar. In the next video, we'll clear out the engine compartment and pull out the powertrain.